Let's talk about one of the biggest blocks to healing from your childhood, and that is telling yourself that it wasn't that bad. Maybe convincing yourself that other people had it much worse, that you didn't have that much to complain about. And this can come up at the beginning of your healing journey, which can make it really hard to get started in the first place, or it can mean that you kind of invalidate yourself and invalidate your own experience right at the beginning. But it also comes up throughout the healing journey, even when you're years in sometimes, you can start to kind of doubt yourself. So let's have a think about where this comes from. I'm a psychotherapist, my name's Sian, and I focus on helping people recover from emotionally immature parenting. And this is particularly pertinent with this topic, with this idea of kind of telling yourself that your childhood wasn't that bad, because emotionally immature parenting, the kind of impact of that often falls under a category that we call small T trauma. So big T trauma are things that are very obviously and quite clearly traumatic. So when we're thinking about childhood, this might be things like abuse. This is kind of severe neglect, a child's basic needs not being met. So those things would fall under big T trauma. Also things like domestic violence, either the child witnessing domestic violence or being subject to violence from their parents. So these things, most people would quite quickly and easily agree are traumatic. However, with emotionally immature parents, it's more subtle often. So that means that the issues come from often what isn't done, often what isn't offered. So maybe that's not enough. There wasn't enough love, enough connection, enough acceptance, enough validation. And all of these things happening daily or regularly for a sustained period of time, that does create what we call developmental trauma. That's another way of talking about this. So small T trauma or developmental trauma. And when you've experienced emotionally immature parenting, it can be quite difficult to kind of really recognize it as traumatic in any way. And also it can be really hard to, I suppose, kind of face the reality of the impact that it's had, because it kind of manifests itself in all of these small ways. With big T trauma, maybe it's a one-off, maybe it's not a one-off, but it's kind of very differentiated from normal everyday life typically. Whereas with emotionally immature parenting, it's kind of woven into your entire childhood experience and your kind of experience of the world and of yourself in your formative years. So it can be really difficult to see the wood for the trees, if you like, and to kind of recognize what was really happening, how it was impacting you, and how it's still affecting you now. So we've talked about this kind of big T trauma, little T trauma, and this is one of the ways that we can often dismiss our own experiences by comparing, right? By saying, well, other people have had it much worse, and therefore my experience doesn't count or isn't valid, or it kind of doesn't need to be looked at in the same way. But actually, this is really not how the nervous system works. If you are being criticized, let's say, think of an example, if your mother was critical of you in public, including, or in private indeed, but let's think of this humiliation wound that might have occurred. So maybe you were in front of your friends, maybe you were in front of your parents' friends, and she was critical of you, critical of maybe how you looked or something you did or didn't do. Maybe she told you off in some kind of way in front of people. That is jarring for your nervous system, and that can feel really traumatic if it's not repaired, if there's not any explanation, if nobody is there to say it's okay, she's out of line, that isn't okay. If there's nobody there to help you with that side of things, then that can feel really disorienting, like you're very much disconnected and alone and unsafe. So that feels traumatic. Now, the fact that somebody else might somewhere be experiencing something very physically abusive, for example, or that there's a child somewhere who isn't getting the food that they need, or that is kind of being quite significantly neglected in some way, obviously that is just as sad and tragic, but it doesn't make any difference to your nervous system in that moment when you're being verbally criticised. I hope that makes some sense. I guess I'm just trying to convey the fact that the comparison thing kind of doesn't work, because your nervous system, just like everybody else's, we all kind of require certain things from the people caring for us when we are vulnerable children, when children who are completely reliant on the adults around them. And if those criteria, if you like, are not met, criteria, the need for love, for acceptance, for validation, and for emotional connection and safety, if those needs are not met, it does feel traumatizing when that happens over and over again for a sustained period of time. And so comparing that experience to somebody else's experience, it kind of doesn't hold up, I suppose. So now I want to think about the fact that emotionally immature parents can really distort your sense of your own truth and reality. So there's something that often happens with emotionally immature parents, and that is that they use their feelings, their emotional world, as a kind of barometer for fact and truth. So that's why you might have recalled as a child, and maybe now as an adult, getting into conversations or arguments, disagreements with an emotionally immature parent that ended up making not a lot of sense, that kind of felt like a big vortex that you were being sucked into, in which what they were feeling, everything kind of gets filtered through what they were feeling, basically. So if they were feeling attacked, it's because you were attacking them. If they were feeling upset about something, it's because you were upsetting them. Their whole perception of reality can become, especially when they're under stress or feeling attacked, it just becomes about how they are feeling. Kind of objective fact, objective reality and truth doesn't really come into it, and they certainly wouldn't have had space for your truth or your reality or your feelings. And so what that can mean is there can be this erosion of self-trust that happens over time for you as the child of an emotionally immature parent, an adult child of an emotionally immature parent. You may recognize it, you find it hard to trust yourself sometimes, you doubt yourself a lot. Maybe you wonder if you got it right, or did I remember that right? Is that true? I'm not quite sure. This kind of doubt that sets in when you've had these interactions with an adult, when you've been a child, that have been very destabilizing, that haven't really made any sense, that haven't really aligned with reality as you see, feel, and understand it. And so then when you become an adult and you're reflecting on your childhood and you're thinking about your experiences through the lens of trauma and healing and kind of impact, then it can be really easy to doubt yourself and to think, I'm making a fuss of this, I'm making this more of a big deal than it really is. If what I'm saying so far is resonating with you, my new book is out. It's called How to Heal from Emotionally Immature Parents, and it breaks a lot of this stuff down in way more detail. So that's just a heads up if that might be helpful for you. But I just want to get across this idea that you can find yourself needing very much to heal from your childhood, but constantly kind of going back and forth between feeling maybe angry and upset about some of the things that happened and the dynamics that you had to manage as a child, and then also thinking that you're kind of making a bigger deal of it than it needs to be, and that other people had it much worse and that it wasn't all that bad. So, not having your emotions validated as a child has a big impact on how much you come to trust your own emotions as an adult, right? So that is what can create that kind of oscillating between those two emotional states, or maybe more than two emotional states, when you're kind of ping-ponging back and forth. And emotionally immature parents typically do not know how to validate their children's emotions well or at all. And so, you may have said to them, I feel angry about that, whatever it may have been. And if their response was, well, you shouldn't feel angry about that, or that's silly, or you're being over the top, or you're, not kind of making any sense, or there's, wife being angry, you're just being kind of spoilt, or whatever it might be. If these were the types of responses you were getting to your big emotions, then now when you feel a big emotion, it makes sense that you're kind of maybe doubting why you're feeling that, or you're telling yourself that you shouldn't be feeling that way. So it all gets a bit kind of, it kind of folds in on itself, and, it can really result in you ending up not doing the work that you need to, or kind of stopping part way as well, which I've seen happen quite a lot. So as a therapist, I just want to validate that if you didn't get your emotional needs met as a child, it is traumatic, and it is significant to the development of your sense of yourself. It's also going to significantly impact how you relate to other people, how you show up in relationships, and also how much you feel able to trust yourself. And this has been confirmed time and time again. And there's nothing tangible that's ever going to kind of come to you and say, as proof, if you like, of your childhood and how it still affects you now. That is unlikely to happen. This is all about how you feel as you move through the world day to day, and also what you have deduced from the type of parenting that you've had. This doesn't need to be solid, clear memories, but it's a kind of felt sense of how things were for you growing up. And if those two things point to the fact that your parents were not emotionally mature and that they were not emotionally equipped to offer you what you needed as a child, those core needs, those core developmental needs for love, for safety, for connection, for security, for validation, emotional validation, if those things were missing, then it will have had an impact. So I hope that there's a way for you to kind of move towards that part of you that recognizes that things weren't okay in your childhood, and that you've kind of suffered as a result. And that is what can set you on the path to healing. This isn't about blaming your parents. It's about acknowledging your experience, taking that seriously, taking your own reality seriously, even if maybe they weren't able to, and therefore moving forward in a much healthier way. If this has been helpful for you, then do take a look at my new book, and also follow along on this channel. I'll be talking here exclusively about emotionally immature parenting and how to recover from it. Take care.